So this little video is about the unique insight that Socrates applied to invent philosophy, or to come to the conclusion that objective self-consciousness was the secret to the problem of happiness. The Apology, which we are reading, occurred in 399 BC, and remember it is Socrates' defense or apology before the Athenian jury on the charges of corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. And we're pretty sure that this is the real Socrates, and he said something like these words. The ending of the Apology is the basis for our first two presentations and our first two questions on the midterm exam. The first question is going to talk about Socrates' claim that an unexamined life isn't worth living, which is the basis of our first presentation that we're talking about now. And the ending passage where Socrates gives an argument that death isn't a bad thing is the basis for the second presentation about death. So Socrates' main insight was to argue that objectivity was not only the solution to the problem of knowledge or how we can best know something, but was also the solution to the problem of happiness. So many thinkers and many human beings had recognized that if you want to learn how to plant your crops, if you want to learn how to build a pyramid or a bridge or a house, you can't always just trust on culture or trust on what comes naturally. You have to use some foresight, you have to use some objective examination, and what we now call science or technology, which is based upon reflective examination of the assumptions you're making and doing something to see if they actually work and improving them through experience. But normally up to then, people would have thought that to be happy, you just do what comes naturally or follow your culture or your community's way of life. And you don't get scientific about happiness. So Socrates' insight, what we're calling Socrates' invention of philosophy, his love or zeal for objective self-consciousness, was the recognition that the key to happiness was objective self-consciousness. So some background about why Socrates is doing what he's doing might be useful. So Socrates, the claim that he was corrupting the youth was based upon this practice of Socrates of going around and asking people questions and somehow revealing that they may not know as much as they think they know. And he's doing this, and he refuses to stop doing it, even on the pain of death, because he's on a sort of quest. The Delphic oracle, the same oracle of Delphos, or at the temple of Apollo at Delphos, that had made the predictions about Oedipus, had said that Socrates was the wisest person in all of Athens. And Socrates had said, how can that be the case, since there's lots of things that I don't know how to do. I can't tame horses, I can't write poems, I can't lead an army, I can't perform the correct rituals for a sacrifice according to the religious practices of Athens at that time. So he went around asking people who did know how to do those things to see how it could be the case that he was the wisest person in Athens. And eventually he's going to come to the conclusion that the oracle is right. And in asking people these questions, it's not that he discovered they were fakes or phonies, that they didn't know how to do what they said they could do. They could build houses, they could tame horses, they could build pots or make shoes if they were a cobbler. But he discovered that the one thing that they didn't know was why they were doing things that way. The carpenter knew that to plumb the door, you had to set it up this way and apply the square in a certain way to make sure the door hung correctly. But he didn't know the reasons behind those practices or principles or habits. Of course, Socrates didn't know the answer to those why questions either. He didn't know how to hang the door or make the shoes or make the pot. But Socrates came to the conclusion that indeed he was the wisest person in Athens, because at least he knew that he didn't know. So that should strike us as somewhat strange. It would be strange to say on the final exam, I don't know, and I know that I don't know, and expect an A. So we'll have to think a little bit about what it means to say that you're the wisest person because you know that you don't know. Socrates' view is based upon this view of objectivity and subjectivity that we had talked about last time. And one way of seeing his insight is as a better way of understanding that dichotomy between the animal and the divine, between the subjective and the objective, or the feeling and the reflective. That was the basis of the Greek tragic view's claim that there was something defective in human nature itself. Socrates saw that on the one hand, there's part of us that lives in the moment, that's our stream of consciousness, that experiences all of our experiences from the inside. And there's another part of ourself, the objective self, that looks at ourself from the outside, that sees all our events just like it was an observer seeing them from the outside. So the one thing that you do know more clearly when you know that you don't know is yourself. You don't know more about trees. You don't know more about how to tame a horse, or about doors, or about pots. But you do know yourself better. You know your limitations. And when you become objectively self-conscious and ask yourself those questions about your assumptions, you're stepping outward into that real self. So when Socrates says that the unexamined life isn't worth living, even though it's going to cost him his life if he refuses to stop talking and asking people questions, he realizes that it's hard to get people to understand this, because it's hard to see why objective examination of our consciousness at every moment is a higher type of happiness than any other type of happiness. You can sort of get an idea of what Socrates is thinking of by the pictures of the little zombies here. In some sense, he's going to be suggesting that to be merely conscious and not self-conscious is to not really be living. So he's going to suggest that a life in which you're not completely and continually objectively self-conscious is not even a life worth living for a human being. And it's important to see just how radical a statement that is. He's not saying examination is good, do it every now and then to plan out your life and think about your goals and make sure that you're not missing something or making some terrible mistake. He's really suggesting that a life in which you're not continuously objectively self-conscious and transparently aware of what you're doing and why you're doing, and asking yourself whether it's the right thing to do or not, is truly a life that isn't worth living for a human being. And it's important to see why Socrates thought that and what his argument was. Because most of us would admit that examination of our lives and our limits is a good thing. Remember, the Greek tragic view had taken as their motto, know thyself, and by that they meant know your limits. Examine your limits, know what you are, so you don't overstep them and land in some awful tragedy or awful mistake. We just saw that when Socrates says know thyself, he means something completely different. He's going to mean know the real part of yourself. Step outside of your limits and boundaries and step into your objective self, the more real part of yourself. So we'd all recognize that it's good to know your limits to avoid stupid mistakes. It would be good if you knew before you flew the airplane up into the sky that you don't really know how to do it. Or like the little video that's here that you can click on in the slides, the guy who gets a good rest at the Holiday Inn and thinks that he's a brain surgeon. It would be good to know before you cut someone's brain open that you don't really know how to put it back together. You don't really know how to cure them. So we all recognize that objective examination is a good way of avoiding mistakes and recognizing our limits. But he doesn't think that that's the reason why an unexamined life isn't worth living. That's not at all what Socrates is saying. In fact, he thinks that that reveals a certain type of mistake, because the only reason you're being objective here is to serve your subjective self. But imagine another story. Imagine that we're related to ourselves in a different way. We've all seen the movie Alien, where a parasite goes into you and lives inside of you and then pops out through your stomach. Socrates is asking you to imagine something like that parasite story. That our real self is our objective self, that at one time we were these angelic creatures living in pure mind or pure spirit, and that somehow or other we were infected by our subjective self. We were infected by these bodies, and these bodies are parasites that make our objective self, our consciousness, our spirit, serve as its slave. They're continually saying, feed me, give me pleasure, take away the pain, take away the pain. And the only time we ever allow ourselves to be objectively self-conscious is like in science or technology, where we're serving our feelings, we're serving our subjective self to make ourselves more safe and more secure. But Socrates is going to suggest the real value of objective self-consciousness is something completely different, that we shouldn't be a slave to this subjective self. The reason we examine ourselves isn't to avoid pain, avoid doing something stupid, and to bring ourselves pleasure, because of course Socrates is going to refuse to stop being objectively self-conscious, even if it causes him great pain, even if it costs him his life. He's going to be convinced that if you're a good person, if you know who you are, if you're in your objective self, that nothing can hurt you, no pain, no suffering, even death. And that's because he thinks that the very meaning of happiness itself is objective self-consciousness. Objective examination isn't just useful to serve the subjective self that's saying, feed me, give me pleasure, take away the pain. Objective self-consciousness is the very meaning of happiness. And Socrates hints at this with the little story he tells about how he knows that he's not wrong in refusing any compromises and in accepting the judgment of the jury. Socrates says he has this spirit, or in Greek it would be a daimon, or an intermediary spirit, that always whispers in his ear and tells him whenever he does something wrong. And here Plato is doing a play on words, because the Greek term for happiness is eudaimonia. Sometimes it's translated as blessed by the gods, or having a fortunate spirit. But literally it means to have a good daimon. And of course your daimon should remind you of a conscience, of a little voice that speaks into your ear and tells you when you've done something wrong. So literally, happiness is having a good objective self-consciousness. Objective self-consciousness isn't just something useful to serve your subjective self, to avoid pain and give you pleasure. Happiness itself is being your real self, is stepping out of your stream of consciousness into this objective point of view, because that's what and who you are most truly. So even though it may not seem like it's the case that many of us believe an unexamined life isn't worth living, if we were to watch our behavior, we would see that instead of trying to examine our life as often as possible, we often go to great lengths to knock out that little guy who's looking over our shoulder. We drink inebriating fluids. We take various different drugs. We watch TV. We play games, all in the effort to distract ourselves from whatever difficulties or worries or troubles we might have, and to enjoy the moment without the objective self or objective examination getting in the way and bringing us down and casting shade on our enjoyment. This is an argument we'll call the diversion argument that we'll talk about in the presentation, that we all divert ourselves from our worries and enjoy the good feelings that come from avoiding thinking about all our troubles. And it seems that if we agree that that's a good thing to do and that the happiness we get from that is real, it seems like we disagree with Socrates, because it seems that we believe that the happiness that comes from ignoring our objective state is still real happiness and it isn't mistaken. Whereas there are also all kinds of examples or arguments that support Socrates' position. We'll talk about a number of them, but an obvious one is the way in which we recognize that we wouldn't want to have fake happiness. We wouldn't want to be a drug addict who is really in an objectively terrible state, but feels great pleasure that's based on some artificial stimulus, or artificial chemical um, um, manipulation of our brain states. So we don't think that the drug addict is really happy, but the drug addict feels good. Therefore, we think that the feeling of the subjective self isn't real happiness, even if objectively coming down from the drugs makes us recognize that we're not in a good state. We'd be better off in our real objective self than we would be feeling this fake or mistaken subjective happiness. And there are other famous examples as well, right? We think Socrates thinks that there's something great about being objectively self-conscious. So even if we could be a perfectly satisfied animal like a pig that never had to suffer pain and always experience pleasure, that somehow we'd rather be a human being with all of our discomforts and worries and struggles rather than a pig. And if the idea of being a pig, perfectly satisfied and feeling pleasure, sounds attractive to you, we can imagine a dung beetle whose idea of happiness is a warm, moist ball of crap. His life is a ball of crap and he likes it. So we think that we wouldn't want to be the dung beetle, even though subjectively, from its point of view, it feels good. Its happiness is completely subjective and comes from the satisfaction of its nature in its desires in the food that evolution has chosen for it. But we from the outside can see that even though its feelings are good, that the objective state that it's in is in fact a bad one. In fact, that even makes it worse, that it likes it. Not only is its life a ball of dung, but it's perfectly content and happy in that. Just in the same way, we feel it's even more degrading that the drug addict is in a terrible situation and yet they enjoy it or throw themselves into it. So we'll be talking about how we can try to sort out this muddle that part of us agrees with Socrates and part of us agrees with the Greek tragic view as we